This DJ, he gets down. Go DJ, that's my DJ. This DJ, he gets down. Mixing records while they go. This DJ, he gets down.
All right, y'all. Welcome back to day 2 of week 3. We got unit 12.2 today. We're talking about Saul again. I forgot one of you, maybe it was Jeremy. He said, I said, yeah, you got to do the thing on Samuel and Saul. He said, you only put on there that it was on Saul. So sorry about that. Yeah, yesterday it was Samuel. Really, it's Hannah, Samuel, and a little bit of Saul. Today it's Saul and his downfall, and then looking forward towards David. Okay. Hopefully this video will be around that 5-minute mark, and let's just jump right into it. So yesterday we talked about this idea of Saul being anointed as the Messiah, the Christos, and this is an image for Christ, but not a type of Christ. And you're going to see that Saul is ultimately not a type of Christ. The thing about Saul is that he's kind of the inverse, right? You can think of the Israelites desired this king. They picked what they thought was the best kind of king, and they're like, yeah, now we've got it. Whereas we saw with like Moses, God chose Moses and it worked out, right? God chose Abraham, Jacob, Isaac and Jacob, and it worked out. God chose Joseph and it worked out. None of those guys were the ones you would have picked, and it worked out. The Israelites, we got to pick our guy. It's not going to work out. Kind of like the Browns taking Johnny Manziel. Well, the Browns taking anybody. It doesn't work out, right? They think they got their guy, and it doesn't work out. Whereas you'll see David is much more like our boy Drew Brees, where nobody wanted him because they didn't think he was good enough, and then the Saints, right, pick him up and things work out. Yeah, there's a little connection there. Okay, sorry, let's go quickly. All right, so what happens? What gets Saul into trouble? Well, one of the things that Saul does pretty quickly, pretty early on, is that he kind of abandons the whole Jewish tradition. He kind of abandons the idea of worshiping God. And you can see how this would be pretty easy to do at any point, right? You can think of any of our political leaders and how quickly they abandoned their core values just to secure the next election or something like that. But all these other kings out there at this time believed that they themselves were gods or had this divine blood. And so Saul kind of slips into this, and he says, you know what, I'm going to decide what true worship looks like. Rather than talking to Samuel, right, God's kind of appointed mediator that we talked about yesterday, rather than listening to the traditions of my people, my religion, instead I'm just going to decide, you know what, I'm the king, I get to call the shots. It doesn't go well for him. And so Samuel immediately says, your descendants will not rule after you, which is like the worst thing to hear if you're a king, right? Because you think, my line will live on forever. And for people in antiquity, that was a big deal. It was kind of a way of saying, like, I myself will live on forever, right? Like, my family line will be the ruling family forever. Therefore, in some ways, I am eternal. I live on past my death. And so this is pretty big. Does not sit well with the big dog, Saul. So they go to battle at this place called Amalek. And God basically says, like, it's through my intervention that you guys are going to win. And so therefore, I desire, don't take the spoils of war for yourself. And Saul basically defies all of these orders, right? So he takes the best stuff for himself and he destroys what he thinks is worthless. And the classic example here that we kind of already previewed is that what is often worthless in the eyes of men is very useful in the eyes of God. Think of Hannah, right? Think of Abraham. Think of Isaac. Think of all these stories. Moses is literally given away down a reed basket, and he ends up saving the Israelites, right? And so after this, this is what we're about to see. Samuel saying to Saul, "How dare you?" This is exactly how it looked too. Okay, so what happens? Saul says, "Oh, my bad, God. I got things mixed up. I thought that you wanted all that good stuff that I kept for myself. I was going to give that to you later. I was planning this big old sacrifice for you. That's my bad, right?" It's like that's my fault. Then he also said, if I didn't let my soldiers take and pillage the whole town, I would have had a riot on my hands. And no one can have a riot on their hands at times like these. Like, I have to think of my boys. And Samuel's not buying it. God's not buying it. And so Samuel refuses to pardon Saul. So you can kind of think of Samuel's declaring like, look, I've talked to God, and you're not being forgiven, because these are also lies, right? Like, it's not just that these are legitimate excuses and Saul was acting what he thought was just and just got confused. Like, he's just making excuses, right? And so Saul gets mad and he rips Samuel's mantle, his cloak, and you could think of it in terms of like Samuel's public image of his authority as this mediator between the people and God. It'd be kind of like if you went up to a priest and like tore off his chasuble, right? Or you could think of going up to like a soldier and ripping off his ribbons on there and saying like, I don't like what you're doing, and like, you're fired or whatever. So Samuel once again prophesies to Saul. Saul's not getting the picture here, right? Like, he's pretty stubborn. It's not going to work out for him. And so Samuel once again prophesies that just as Samuel's mantle was torn, the kingship will be torn away from Saul, right? So again, you've got this twofold repetition of the same thing, that your line will fall. And that's exactly what happens. And so you probably saw from the Bible Project video, you've got this decline and rise at the same time, right? So you've got Saul falling as David is rising. And they kind of overlap a little bit. It's not a one-to-one scenario here. So we'll preview this, and then we're going to look at David tomorrow. So God says, look, Saul's not working out. Samuel, I want you to go to your boy Jesse, and I want you to go interview his sons, and amongst them I will reveal to you, I will show to you who I believe should be the king. And you probably heard the story of the Jesse tree, and that's going to come a little bit later, but you can see Jesus up here, right? So, and it's pretty cool how they have like the highest level of the angels at the top here for Jesus, but it's through this line that Jesus will be a descendant, right? So this line is the one that lasts forever, not Saul's line. So Samuel interviews all the sons, and Samuel's like, Jesse, you got any other sons? Like, well, there's David. I mean, you're not going to want him, though. He's like, well, bring David to me, because he's basically said, it's none of these other ones. So he brings in David, and David is, and you've heard this story, right? David and Goliath. He's not the big dog, right? He's not tall and handsome. He's a young guy. He's the youngest son of Jesse. He's out there, tending the sheep. He's a shepherd. He's not a warrior, at least not at this point, right? And Samuel says, this is the guy. This is the guy. And it's kind of this opposite moment, right, of the people saying, we got our boy. Saul's our guy. He's the one that like looks kingly. We got him. And this is the opposite, right, where all of the ones that you thought would be picked are rejected, and the one who is the least likely to be picked is the one God selects, this shepherd. Now, if you're not catching the imagery at this point, it's pretty blatant, right? David's a shepherd. You're not expecting him. Do you know anybody else in the Bible who talks about sheep analogies and who you wouldn't expect to be the king? Obviously, it's Jesus, right? And so the similarities are going to be blatant with David. You're going to see throughout the David story, he is like, in the Jewish tradition, not that the Jewish tradition would lead directly to Christ, but for them, this is like almost as good as it gets. The kingdom of David, David's reign, he's looked up as the king, the ruler. And the type of Christ that David is so clear, so obvious, that we can't help but talk about it in more detail. So that's where we're going to stop for today, because tomorrow I really want to spend much more time talking about how David is a type of Christ. Now, David's not perfect. We all know about David's big sin, and we'll talk about that tomorrow. But what David does in the midst of his sin is unique, at least in the line of kings that we're going to look at. And we'll get into that story tomorrow, okay? So don't forget to do the end questions. There's going to be another 3 pages to read in the textbook, and I will see you guys in the next one.